Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming in on 4/18 on a Sunday. It means a lot, actually. I know the weather's just changed too, so it means even more in that context. Welcome to today's session. I'd like to just begin by acknowledging that we're meeting today on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay respect to their elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty remains unceded. I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from wherever you're tuning in today, and acknowledge all mob today in the audience. Today's session is really exciting. It's about process and the process of writing, and it's a session that, when I thought about it, called a lot of exciting ideas to mind. And I couldn't be more thrilled than to be doing this with the three incredible writers we have here today. I'll begin with Melissa Lukashenko, who appears on the screen at the moment. Melissa Lukashenko is a guru woman of Bundjalung and European heritage. She first debuted in 1997 with a novel called Steam Pigs, about a Murri woman and her search for her identity. And since then, she's had a remarkable career. Her most recent novel, Too Much Lip, won the 2019 Miles Franklin Literary Award. And she's also a founding member of the human rights organization Sisters Inside, and most recently was a judge alongside myself and three other judges of the Stella Prize. To my left is Claire Coleman. Claire Coleman debuted in 2017 with a novel entitled Terra Nullius. It was written on a black and white writing fellowship, and she quickly followed it up in 2019 with The Old Lie. The Old Lie. I'm always afraid of saying the actual quote, the oldest lie. And she also had her first work of non-fiction in just last year, Lies, Damn Lies. It's a cover you can't miss either. And she's working, actually I should mention Melissa's working on a new novel, I believe, and Claire has a novel forthcoming with Hachette. Thank heaven I said that right. Hachette in July, entitled Enclave. So very exciting. Warm round of applause for Claire as well. Thanks. Finally, I was terrified. I should mention Claire is a Noongar woman, and I should say I was terrified, and I asked Charmaine. She very kindly told me how to pronounce the names of the nations she belongs to. She's a Wurundjeri Badamaya Wulinu woman from WA, and her most recent books include Nanajungu Yagu, a collection of poetry from Cordite that was award-winning and widely acclaimed, and False Claims of Colonial Thieves, which was a collaboration with the West Australian poet John Kinsella. She has two works forthcoming. One is entitled The Art, an ekphrastic collection of poetry that's coming in July with Magabala, and a non-fiction work entitled Female Data Sovereignty and Conversations that will come later on this year. Please welcome Charmaine Peptalk Green. So, yeah, I was really excited about this session. And I hope everyone is excited to talk about process, because when we think about process, we often think about something like maybe the Paris Review, that I imagine must get new subscribers every year, because they'll tell you, hey, in 1982, Toni Morrison said this, wouldn't you believe it? Or they'll tell you that in 1996 or 1994, David Foster Wallace said this. And what they'll say might be, did you write with a pencil or a typewriter? And we'll try to elevate the conversation above that, but actually I don't think those questions are not worth asking. And I think the where you are as a writer, the why, and the how and the what, even down to the question of did you use a pencil or a typewriter, can be very meaningful. I might begin, Melissa, with yourself. I think of the writers today, although I understand, Charmaine, you've been writing for a long time, your first publication was in 2000? 2007, although an anthology in 2000?
An anthology in 1988.
1988. Well, Charmaine may have been the first published among us. Well, then I'll put this question to either of you. Well, I'll direct it actually to Melissa first and Charmaine, if you'd like.
That's fine.
But my question is to ask about longevity. Has your process changed over time? And how do you maintain longevity as a writer? Melissa, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, Declan. I'm also on Wurundjeri country and would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and elders. I'm sure my process has changed heaps over that time. It's almost 30 years, or getting on for 30 years now, so, you know, I'd have to be some kind of freak if my process hadn't changed at all. I know when I started my first novel, Steam Pigs, although I'd written one article with a friend called Odette Best, and we wrote about... I'd written two articles, one about family violence and another one about feminism, a critique of mainstream feminism. But yeah, when I wrote my first novel, I basically thought, rather than doing what I'd done all my life and think, oh, such and such is too hard, I won't even try, is I thought, well, I'll start and I'll see how hard it is, and if it's too hard, I'll give up then. So kind of pushed out the failure and giving up part of it. And I got 12,000 words down and I thought, oh, this isn't that hard after all. And then I sat down and sketched out a bit of a rough plot and kept going from there. These days I spend a lot of time on research and a very long time on plotting. I'm very much a plotter. So it's changed in that sense as well as in lots of others, I guess. Things change when you know you can write a novel as opposed to when you don't know if you can do it or not, when it's an unknown.
What do you find plot provides you that other elements of the novel perhaps don't?
The illusion of control. It provides me with lots of sleepless nights because it's your brain just goes into this Gordian knot. You know, it's like someone's got a fishing net and they've chucked in a few old dead fish frames and emptied a rubbish bin in there and then set it on fire, and then you try to, in your brain, you try to sort it all out and make it into something that looks like a fishing net again. So yeah, it supplies a lot of angst, but it does basically supply the illusion of control. And it's basically because I'm too lazy to spend 6 months or 12 months on a piece of work and then realise that I've gone in the wrong direction and I've got to junk it. Something in me just can't come at that idea at all. So I prefer to do the very difficult work of plotting before I start.
Charmaine, how do you navigate the question of intuition in writing versus control, or things that provide comfort for you as a writer? Do you have a process?
Not really, no. I write anywhere and everywhere. It depends on my mood. I could write in a really busy, noisy cafe, and then other times I want total silence and move, like... for instance, the last two books, False Claim of Colonial Thieves and Nganajungu Yagu, were back to back. So I was finishing one and started writing the other. And I actually left my house. I moved out of my home to go and live on the hill to write, which caused a big uproar in Geraldton with the gossip and separations and all sorts of things. But then I walked around later and said, looky, I've got 2 books now. After that process. So I don't really think a lot about how and why, or maybe I think a lot about why, but how and process and those sorts of things. But my practice, I go back to my school diaries to have a look if the way I think has been consistent. and what's changed as I've gotten older. And looking in my school diary, I write about country and I write about things happening in the community, and I still do that, but I do it in a different sort of a way now, and maybe with a little bit more aggression to force words out there.
You've been very prolific of late. It's interesting that you mentioned going back to your diaries, because one thing that I admire about your writing is the vulnerability on the page. I think vulnerability is very important for writers. Often you can write something that is stylistically compelling, but without vulnerability, it doesn't tend to last in your mind or the reader's mind as well. So I admire you for the fact that in Nanajungu Yagu, you have these letters between your younger self and your mother. And even in the book with John Kinsella, False Claims of Colonial Thieves, collaborating with another writer is also quite vulnerable. Have you reflected on vulnerability in your writing?
Yeah, I reflect on vulnerability all the time because I have to tread lightly with any of the writing I do. And even I had a small collection in 2017 just like that, which was like my baby poetry. It was my teenage poetry and in my early 20s and 30s. And I had to leave. I was working with the federal government at the time, and I was talking about Vanstone and the then Prime Minister producing this little baby called Whole of Government, and I was working for them, and I was told to keep it on the down low. And then like a year later I thought, well, I think I better resign because I don't want anyone telling me what to say and what to write. They have no right to do that, and I can get money and get work elsewhere. With Nanajungu Yagu, it took me a long time to even write about any of my family because there's been a lot of trauma and there's lots of things that happen in Western Australia which you kind of have to live in the state to believe the oppression that's placed on us, and words allow that shackle to kind of let go. I put myself in very vulnerable places, even collaborating with John Kinsella, and people saying, why are you writing with a white man? And it took me a year to even respond to him to do a collaboration because I had all these things in my head. Why am I doing this? Why am I wanting to write with a white person? Why? But I watched John for a year, and I watched his movement, and I watched how he respects living on Yungar country, and I watched our common ground, and it put me into a place. But it doesn't mean to say those kind of comments didn't come after False Claim of Colonial Thieves came out. Those sort of comments still came, and even in the book reviews, they decided to put me into the colonised and him into the coloniser, and John as this great giant literature person and me as this poor little Yamaji woman coming from this little community. And I found that very interesting as well, and very vulnerable. And also, when this book came out, people walked across the other side of the road. I come from a mining state. No one wants you to talk against mining.
It's very... and it's interesting you talk about that perhaps condescending reception, especially because when I saw the book, I saw the opposite. I thought John Kinsella must have been very deferential, even in his own mind, in writing these poems with you. I thought it must have been humbling. Claire, travel is a big part of the through line of your novels, both in, of course, The Old Lie, where the protagonist is constantly running. Terra Nullius, your first novel, and in The Old Lie, there's as many forms of travel through space and time. Of course, you wrote Terra Nullius while travelling in a van, and you've mentioned that The Old Lie also came out of that experience of travel, What does travel mean to you in its relationship with your writing?
In opposite to Melissa, I am a terrible plotter or planner of novels. I treat my writing like it's a roller coaster ride. I hop on and see where I go, and I never know what's going to happen. Which means that completely by accident, my life experiences at the time become the life experience of the character. Terra Nullius, I was travelling in a caravan, and all my characters are in the bush, wandering or travelling or on the run, which seemed interesting. I've been homeless in Melbourne, and many of my characters are homeless. So it's kind of, I'm in all my stories, whether I want to be or not. And then The Old Lie, someone actually asked whether The Old Lie has travel embedded in it, like whether my life experience at the time was part of that story. And like the first time I asked that question, because Terra Nullius obviously was, it was obvious that my travelling around the country, particularly in Noongar country, then in Yamaji country, was so much a part of that story. And I thought about it, and I suddenly abruptly realised that I'd actually written half the novel, I would say, and edited most of it in airport departure lounges on book tour. And there were characters who spent the entire novel pretty much refugees in airport departure lounges, essentially. So it's like, oh my God, it's an airport departure lounge novel where they're all stuck in airport departure lounges in space. Oh my God, what the hell happened there? So obviously whatever I'm doing is in my stories. And my next novel is really kind of claustrophobic and within a city. And I spent that novel, a large chunk of the edits of that, in lockdown. So there's this kind of, I can't help but let what's going on in my life get into my fiction, whether I want to or not. Mainly because I don't plan. But I don't find maybe planning would be useful. Possibly, but it might not be as fun, and that's the thing. I started writing primarily because it was enjoyable, and to be honest, I'm still a bit shocked that people actually buy my books sometimes.
You can imagine the Nobel Prize pundits just calculating whether Claire G. Coleman should be awarded something and going, well, if there's a bit more planning. But that is fascinating, you're right. Enclave has that confined title that I hadn't realised stood in distinction to the width and the sense of travelling in your previous work. Has it always been the case since you began writing, and perhaps you could also tell us what your formative experiences of writing were, that you were writing from what was happening in the moment?
Sure, I was for a while I was a Melbourne street poet. Not actually literally in the street, but people like talked about me being a punk poet in Melbourne, which is weird because that was when I was in my late 20s, and that's a bit late to be one of the kind of wild punk poets of the city. I was a bit old for the job, but I used to write performance poetry, and I think my performance poetry habit, and thinking about performance poetry, I didn't do it on stages or polite places or cafes or nice venues. I was often hired by punk or indie bands to open their gigs, which if in that sort of environment, you've got to get attention very quickly, and you've got to walk in and try and take over the room when everyone's talking and try and shut them up with the quickest way possible. So I think that experience taught me a certain way of writing, a lyrical stripped down style that's kind of stuck in my novels. It doesn't seem stripped down, but it is. I try and say everything in the most elegant use of words possible in order to try and get my point across as quickly as possible.
Who was the hardest punk band to open for?
I actually can't remember, but I do remember walking into a punk music open mic night and just suddenly saying, right, this is like my first ever time doing poetry on stage. I walked into to a music open mic night and just got up on stage and did poetry. And that was a wild experience because people, it took them a while to shut up, but then I had to improv a couple of lines in order to get their attention, and that worked. So it's from that moment on, the improv lines are kind of the most important ones.
Melissa, I wonder if actually you could talk to the question of getting people's attention, because it's a big part of your work as well, and the sense of writing people into Australian literature who might not be between the pages of our covers so often. And also, what were your formative experiences of writing for the first time and the impulse to write?
Yeah, I think I've had the impulse to write from very young. My first piece of literature that I ever composed, I think I wrote on the back of a horse when I was about 8 or 9, and something to do with the rhythm of the horse's hooves going through the bush near my family home. And I have no memory of the poem itself now, but I composed a poem at that really young age. So there's definitely something innate that makes people write, I think. Yeah, I wrote for English at school.
Yeah.
I wrote terrible angst-ridden adolescent poetry, like a lot of people do. But it was going to university that taught me to write well. It taught me to strip sentences back, as Claire was saying, make things as concise as they can be. In terms of getting attention, I mean, that's the $60 million question, and if I could explain it simply in a 1 minute answer, we'd all be writers, I guess.
Well, go ahead then. Oh, you don't want to give the game away, I guess. We got to.
When a short word will do. But Elmore Leonard or someone once said, I write the same way as everybody else, but I leave the boring bits out. I think that's a pretty good recipe.
Elmore Leonard also mentioned actually that whenever he writes something where he feels as though it sounds like writing, he deletes it. Do you sympathise with that? Yeah.
I don't do that consciously. Maybe I do it unconsciously. I tell you what I do delete or I never actually write is I never write about writing. I'm doing a bit of a memoir-y thing at the moment that I may or may not publish because I've just, after many years, gone back to live in northern New South Wales. I've been coming and going across the border for a long time, part-time there and part-time in Brisbane, but for the first time, because of the floods, my household has been forced across the New South Wales border. So I'm just toying, as well as trying to finish this novel and doing a couple of other things. I'm just toying around with a memoir-y kind of piece. And I find myself with this real resistance to talking at all about the fact that I'm writing a novel or the fact that I'm writing a speech for the Black and Bright Festival, because it was actually the Australian writer David Foster years and years ago at Byron Festival who I had a conversation with him, or he might have said it in a session, the kind of wankery of writing about writing. And unless you're a journalist working for the Paris Review or some other, for Griffith Review or something, I think I really dislike inward-looking writing, and writing about writing is obviously the most inward-looking a writer can get. I don't know if that answers your question.
It raises more questions, given David Foster published an essay collection, Studs and Nogs, where he talked about writing and karate, among other things. So I don't know if it was a put-on.
I wasn't sure how much of it was about writing. I remember some lines about his son and about his Aboriginal son and David's very white Eurocentric interpretation of his son's Aboriginality. Yeah, I'll take your word for it that he also wrote about writing.
If anyone does want to look up the essay Melissa's referred to, it's a wild piece. Actually, one more question, Melissa. You mentioned poetry being one of the earliest things that you wrote. I understand that you were publishing poetry in the early 2000s. You appeared in an anthology, I think might have been called Unearthed. I think Uncle Bruce Pascoe may have also been there alongside many others. And I'm not sure actually how much poetry you may have written or published since then, but why, first of all, poetry? Why poetry to begin with as your initial, I guess, first pieces of writing, and why did you turn away from it perhaps later on?
I have actually never considered that, Declan. I know I read a lot of poetry as a school age, child and teenager. And I continue to read poetry today, but probably the proportion is less. Um, uh, I guess I came out of a family where the idea of writing a novel was, I didn't know any writers growing up. I had read poetry, I'd certainly read novels and biographies, but I think the ambition of writing a novel was just so far away from my immediate family background that it just had never popped into my head. Whereas writing a poem is something I would have done for school and would have felt, yes, I've not, the old, it's not if you can't see it, you can't be it. But because I'd written poetry before, I knew how to write a poem, or I thought I did. And I still write poems occasionally, but it's not my identity. My identity is as a novelist, and as a novelist looking towards semi-retirement.
You heard it here first. I remember, I think it was toward the end of high school, and Philip Roth was on a big run of novels, and he would pass reasonably, it was soonish, but he was in his kind of 21st century run of novels that brought him renewed acclaim. And he'd done an interview, and Philip Roth said, when a novelist or a writer is born into the family, that family is finished. And I remember this because my dad ran in with the newspaper article basically warning my family why they might want to be wary that Declan Fry was writing or considering writing. I want to ask about your family's relationships with your work, or even with the decision to be writers. In however you'd like to interpret that, or how your experience has been. Charmaine, perhaps?
My experience has been mixed. I've got an 81-year-old sister cousin, first cousin, who loves poetry, and she says, "Oh, but not your type of poetry, Charmaine." And it's too political. And I'm not going to argue with her about that, but I know she loves poetry. Ngana Jungu Yagu was really an interesting process in looking at the letters my mum wrote to me, and I really had to read them this time. I'd carried them around for over 40 years, but this time I had to read them and look in between the lines, because my mum was mentioning other family members. I come from a family of 14. There's 8 of us still alive, and I'm the third youngest now. So I had to pass a lot of things through, and writing Ngana Jungu Yagu made me realise that the stories in that letter didn't really belong to me. The letters belonged to me. They belonged to my family. So I'd used lots of the letters, and as I was going through the editing in the manuscript, it was getting smaller and smaller until right at the end of the manuscript, I only used a "Dear Charmaine." I only used a tiny slither of my mum's letter as not to upset anyone. And anything I wrote about my parents, I took to my older sisters. My brothers were like, "Oh, yeah, whatever." But like my sisters, I said, "Is this okay? Is anyone going to get wild? I'm writing this. It's part of your story." But there were parts of those letters where Mum said things about my other siblings that I just couldn't use, that they were for me. They weren't. So family are really supportive, but anytime I get excited about a new poem, or I need an audience to kind of read it to, like the mob just say, "Oh, no, you're right. You know what you're doing." That sort of thing. But relationships and families are really important, because you might think you own a family story, but if you're talking about someone else, there's ethics around that, and you should be morally ethical in family stories. That's what this book taught me, is, if you're loving your family, talking about black love, use it in your writing as well.
Did you learn new things about your family, or perhaps their own I suppose, discoveries or reflections that came out of the process or the publication of books like Ngana Jungu Yagu?
Well, this book was actually a chapter in my PhD, so there's a lot of it that wasn't published. This is only a part of it. And I really didn't like my dad growing up because I come from violent and lots of alcohol and a really tough upbringing. And I really thought my dad had no right putting us kids through that, witnessing that sort of trauma and violence. But once I started writing and getting into this, and my dad came into the story in a way that kind of made me think differently, that I broke down on the plane between Geraldton and Perth when I got this realisation that my dad had been put into a place by his own family at 6 years of age into New Norcia. He's not stolen generations for that term, but what happened was he had a lot of things stolen from him and he received the same treatment. So what I learnt in that process was to be a little bit softer and kinder to my dad. And what he was playing out was intergenerational trauma. And what my dad actually taught me, my mum's side filled up my cultural knowledge. They gave me all my cultural knowledge about culture and country. My dad, when he passed, he pushed me on the path of being an artist and other things. But yeah, it's...
How do you find writing memoir and non-fiction, Claire? Because I know there's some vulnerable aspects that you reveal about your identity in Lies Damn Lies. And as someone who also writes fiction, I feel part of the joy of fiction is we can transmute everything. We can write essentially non-fiction. We never have to own up to anything. But, well, although you do reveal yourself a lot in your fiction as a writer, I guess when it's non-fiction, particularly in a country like Australia, where I think the tradition of memoir and social realism and essentially the kind of true story, the Australian story, is something people are quite hungry for, it can be especially vulnerable. So I'm curious to hear about your process of writing non-fiction.
Sure. When I wrote Lies Damn Lies, I was trying to use my personal and my family's experience of colonisation, whilst trying to steer as far from memoir as I could possibly steer. It was talking about the personal story of talking about colonisation from a personal point of view. It meant that I didn't have to unload as much in the way of statistics and quotes and facts, because I'm talking about my family's experience. I could make it kind of the facts are all facts, but I could make it light on referencing and heavy on emotion by making it a bit more of a personal narrative. And that's why I went for the personal life writing structure for it. On the other hand, I try and avoid memoir like the plague, because I feel sometimes that the only books that Australia as a colony wants from Aboriginal people is memoir. And I'm not going to give Australia what it wants. Basically, I'm going to give Australia what I want to give it. And so I wrote what I wrote. And of course, if you've read the book and know you've read the book, there's a section in which, to write my family's history, I actually interviewed my dad. My dad's still alive, and my dad's a Noongar man. He grew up removed from culture, and I interviewed him about the removal, about why he didn't have culture, and about his personal experience of returning to culture. And I collected far more material than I could ever actually use from my dad. And I'll probably interview him again and get more, because I think it's important for Aboriginal people who have living elders we can interview. I think it's important to try and get information out of them while they're still alive. So I did that, but I think sure, it's a vulnerable work, but I think sorry, I think it's vulnerable though to be Aboriginal in a colony that has always wanted us extinct. So already we're already pinned out like a specimen to be. Every time we write, they pin it out like a specimen to try and find a way dissect us until we're dead from our writing. So we're always vulnerable. The minute we write anything, we're vulnerable, be it fiction, non-fiction, poetry. They'll be looking for ways to use that as a weapon against us. If we're always vulnerable, then I don't see any issue with leaning into that vulnerability and using that itself as one of the decolonizing tools, because my writing is predominantly, I suppose, a weapon in the war to decolonize Australia, and if I can use my own spiritual flesh as ammunition in that weapon, I will use it, even at the risk to myself, because I believe that fighting against the colonial experiment of extermination of Aboriginal people is more important than protecting my own person. So, and I'll probably write vulnerably about myself again, because I have the tools to fight, and I will always fight, even at risk to myself. So, it's risky, but it's a risk that I've chosen to take.
We have 20 minutes left, and I did mention at the outset questions of writing with a pen or a typewriter. And I don't want to bore anyone, but I understand it may be meaningful. The places that you write in, the instruments you use to write. I recently started handwriting. I thought it made a big difference. Feel free to opt out if you actually feel it's not a question that interests you. I'm looking at Melissa, perhaps. But if there's any aspect of, I suppose, the physicality of writing that is meaningful to you, Melissa, in terms of how you write, where you write, or is that something you've found has made a difference at all?
Yeah, and I actually love it when writers talk about the little details of how they produce work and where, in what circumstances. So I'm happy to answer. Before I do, I just want to say how much I like Claire's book, Lies and Lies. I found it a very smart book in the context of some discussions around identity that are happening at the moment. And I particularly like, Claire, your I guess theorising, if theorising is the right word, or just your thinking around how culture was removed from your family before the children could be removed. I think that's a really important thought, because there's sometimes people get very literal, oh, this person wasn't removed because the government car didn't turn up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and snatch the children away. But if you make a family or a community or a city or a country town unsafe for a person to be Aboriginal in, then children are removed in lots of ways, and having the culture taken before the individual is physically taken, or instead of the individual being physically taken, in a broad sense, is also child removal. It's definitely falls under that genocide category of cultural extermination, in my view. But yeah, really great book.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you. And to go back to the question, I've worked on a laptop for years and years and years now. I've gone through about half a dozen Hewlett-Packard laptops because I like the brand. But to my horror, modern computer companies all have this stupid mouse where the mouse acts like an iPhone screen. So I can't get my head around it. So I'm now working with a 3 or 4 year old laptop and just desperately hoping that I can finish my novel before the laptop packs it in. Because the technology has basically outlasted me and advanced in front of my capabilities, and I can't use the modern laptops. I tried.
Have you deleted accidentally deleted some great sentences?
In my career, which is more than 25 years now of writing, I've only ever lost one document, and it was a 3,000-word essay, and I immediately rewrote it, and I remembered about 90% of it. So that's one of my claims. I've probably forgotten a lot more than I've accidentally deleted. But yeah, this poor old laptop, it's on its second screen. It's got a big crack down the middle of the keyboard, and it's like it's one step away from being gaffer taped together, not through poverty as it would have been 10 years ago, but just through this stupid technological change that's come and kind of sideswiped me out of nowhere. Yeah, and I write in a recliner because I've got a bad back and I can't sit at a normal desk. So I get to feel very relaxed and almost on holiday as I sit in my recliner each day and tap away.
That sounds nice. Recliner. There we go. Charmaine, do you have a preference for in particular the laptop versus the pen, or place or time when you prefer to write, or it's
Well, I don't trust technology. Yeah, that's my last point of call. For me, it's a pad and pen to start off all my poetry. So I've got like hundreds of journals with writing in, and then once I'm happy with something, I'll go to the laptop or the computer. And I think it's just easier because when you're travelling around and when I'm in a space where I don't have community noise or family noise in my head, that I can write onto paper on the plane, in a cafe, down the beach, all those sorts of things. So my preference first is pen. I just thought, just being a bit old-fashioned that way, but I did have gone through some computers as well and losing work that I couldn't recover and had to rewrite. But it depends on my mood. My house has 5 writing spaces, including outside. I've got noisy family who play games all night, and I've tried to compete with that, close doors, put up signs, book into hotels to write, which I did recently to get the last manuscript into Mugabala. I had to go in the hotel because everywhere I moved in my house there was noise, and I couldn't do it.
It's funny when you say it to compete with your family's noise. The image that I had was you were literally competing by trying to make more noise.
Yeah.
Maybe a la Jack Nicholson in The Shining, just banging away all the time.
It's just it's terrible. So, and it depends on my mood because I move furniture around too just to write. And I don't know if that was procrastination or that sort of thing, but you move furniture around to feel comfortable. Then you get your pen and paper and set up your laptop, get a cup of tea, all those sorts of things. So, but today's a world of technology, so you have to go there in the end. Yeah.
I was actually shocked when I learnt Peter Carey was only using a computer. I mean, for me, it was just sacrilegious that a writer would not use a pen. Having said which, Claire, I haven't asked you if you use a pen or a computer.
It's really hilarious because I wrote Terra Nullius on a MacBook 2 with a crack across the screen and a Bluetooth keyboard. And then when I came to edit it, I had to get a laptop because there's no way you can write a novel on a MacBook. On an iPad, an iPad 2 with a Bluetooth keyboard. You can write a novel on an iPad. Just so you know this, you just can't edit a novel on an iPad. It's impossible. It just can't hack the repaginating when you do edits. It falls apart. But since then I've bought my beloved MacBook Pro, which I have typed to death twice. I have thrashed the keyboard to death twice in 4 years. Which is so. I don't know how much effort it takes to kill a keyboard, but I've done it. I think I don't know how many words they're rated to, but I'm really grateful that Apple had they had a keyboard design that isn't that great, the butterfly keyboard, which broke. But because they broke, there's a class action suit, which means as long as I'm alive, they have to replace that keyboard, which is really good.
Why the computers? Is it familiarity?
No, it's. I
Ease of editing?
I actually write poetry with a pen and paper, for the most part, but with novels. It was after I realised that an average novel length in Australia, an average novel is about 90,000 words. I don't know. I just thought the idea of writing 90,000 words on paper, and then typing it up for my own handwriting just sent me cold. So I'm not going to do that. And it turns out later that that the idea of being able to cut and paste became part of my process as well. And so I think a lot of modern novelists use the laptops. Well, the word processor's abilities to cut and paste, copy and insert as part of the process of writing, being able to remove big chunks, move chunks from one area to another, insert new text. You can actually go, I can't imagine how people did it writing by hand or by typewriter like 50 years ago, because I've actually gone back in and inserted an entire character and storyline later. If I was doing that in the typewriter, I'd have to retype the whole manuscript. And screw that for a game of fun. That is not fun. So I'm a great lover of laptops for writing, but except for poetry, which I hate writing on a laptop, and proofreading, which I hate doing on screen. Because proofreading, because I write on screen, if I proofread on screen as well, it's like I can't do the separate, because for proofread you kind of have to separate yourself from the work and pretend it's not yours in a way, and I can't do that if it's on screen because I write on screen.
Noise. Go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, I just feel like I should mention, we're all published writers, probably with second jobs recently, if not at the moment. And I'm just thinking of my friend, I won't name her because I don't think she'd want to be named, but an Aboriginal woman who has won awards for her writing, who lives in country Queensland and is in such dire poverty that she has trouble finding food for her family and was until pretty recently trying to write a novel on a mobile phone, because I think an iPhone maybe, and that situation's changed for her now, but I just sort of want to recognise that there's a privilege in having electricity and being able to afford a cheap laptop, because and that for a lot of people, if you're in prison, for example, you won't have access to technology, and you'll have to be writing with either pen and paper or pencil and paper or writing in your head. So there's any number of different forms, and some of those forms privilege the writer and some don't.
I think it might have been Solzhenitsyn, perhaps, in the Gulag, who wrote on toilet roll. Or there's many stories.
Boris Bucciani wrote in WhatsApp messages.
Yes, yeah.
Sent to Australia. So that No Friend with the Mountain was written in WhatsApp.
My friend told me writing on her dying mobile phone at the same time that Boris Bucciani put out that book, and it sort of brought home to me really strongly how if you're in the Aboriginal underclass, there's a lot of parallels there with some of the poorest people in the refugee world. Yeah, which is obviously not the situation I find myself in, but I think it's worth acknowledging.
We have just 9 minutes for questions from the audience, and so we're opening it up. If anyone has any questions, there'll be roving mics for any of our lovely panellists today. I'm shocked. I thought, oh no, there'll be so many questions.
They're all quiet.
Hello, thank you for all your insights and words today. This question is for Charmaine and Colonial Thieves. What was it like having to collaborate with another poet in producing a work? Like, what were the challenges or joys of doing that process?
It was very challenging because I did not meet with John at all. It was all over emails, and there was not even any phone calls. So it was reading each other's words. And sometimes John would have to wait for about maybe up to 3 weeks until I dealt with everything in my community and family and could sit down and respond. And he always said to me, if you're not comfortable responding to that, don't. And I think there's only one poem that I kind of questioned him on, but it was challenging. It's a man. I'm responding to this white fella. And but I got through it, and the common ground there was the love for country, and he's, environmentalist and protects country, protects land, and also our mutual feelings against mining, because West Australia is just seen as a big mining state and resources and money, and they trick people, poor people, into thinking that they have to take all the trinkets from them. But it was a challenging process, and I'm doing it. I've just finished doing it all again with him in a different way. Yeah.
Have you met him since?
Yes. I meet up with him every 2 to 3 years. He might come up to Geraldton, or I might see him in Perth. But in January, I got to talk to him. He came up because he's got family in Geraldton, and he's lived in Mullawa and Geraldton, so he's lived on Yamatji country. And got to kind of finish off the manuscript and have some last-minute conversations and introduce him to my writing spaces and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
We have perhaps, I'm not sure whose hand, if everyone can lower their hands, and then when I say go, if you can really quickly, no, I saw a hand up the front, this woman, yes, and also I saw your hand before. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Charmaine, I was just this is to all of you, but something that came up, Charmaine, when you were saying about being in the mood to write, and with all the writing that you're doing at the time, there's so many other things necessarily going on in your lives. What is I'm thinking of it like the thread of focus that when you're involved with other things and then you sit to write and you're in the midst of that writing, what is that sort of, how do you fall into it, I guess is what I'm saying.
I don't know how I fall into it, but what I can say is writing does save me. I've had a lot of suicides in my family, and with deaths in custody, and dealing with how horrible Geraldton is, and with JC, and everything that happens in our community is always in your head. And if you're a person who speaks out against people and are not frightened to, then you're always called upon. And then it sometimes, and especially for when JC got murdered, my sister died the week before, and so I was called upon to call the rally, the protest, to lead everything in Geraldton. It took me 3 weeks before I could get back to writing, and I guess writing just saves me all the time.
Melissa or Claire, did you have any thoughts?
I treat writing like it's a job, because it is my job. It's actually my only job. And so therefore, if I'm not in the mood for writing, I will sit down until I am. And you sit, and people say to me, "Oh, how do you write so much?" I say, because the non-payment of my rent if I don't write is like a gun to my head every day.
I understand. Unless, Melissa, you had anything to say, I was going to take one more question. Are you okay? Yeah.
But what Charmaine just said, and the tremendous effort and the tremendous gift of writing to be contributing to the tapestry of our writing, Charmaine, in those circumstances. To say thank you for what you do and who you are.
Thank you, Melissa. Yeah.
I saw one more hand up. Yes, thanks.
Sorry, take off my mask. My question is for Melissa. One of the things that stands out every time I read any of your writing is the way your characters speak and the vernacular, how it is so true to life. I wanted to ask about how you get the generational and cultural different voices to come so true.
Yeah, it's a bit funny talking to someone when I don't know who you are or what you look like, but I will.
It's the voice of God.
It's sort of an answer that isn't an answer, and it may be fairly irritating if you're a writer yourself, but I've always found dialogue extremely easy to write, and I simply think it's a brain thing. I think that part of my brain that hears speech is more highly developed than other bits of my brain, and so I might struggle to convey a sort of philosophical concept or a theoretical or even just a visual image, but the dialogue is just there. You know, if I've got the character, I suppose part of it is in character development. But yeah, I've literally never struggled to give a character a voice in my life. So maybe it's just my luck that I was born with that particular skill. Yeah.
Charmaine or
And-
Claire, do you have any thoughts? Oh, sorry.
Learning. Yeah.
I'm the opposite. I struggle with dialogue, but I never find it difficult to describe something. I'm good at putting what's around me into words, but I always struggle to find the characters' voices. So I'm the opposite to Melissa, yet we make it work somehow.
We've only got 1 minute left. Sorry.
Starting
Someone
to
in the
think-
audience is saying I should pay attention to Melissa. Melissa, please. Sorry, Melissa, did you have something you want to add?
I'm just behaving like I'm sitting next to you all and I can chime in quickly. I was saying, I think Claire's doppelganger. She's a pantser and I'm a plotter, and I'm good at the dialogue and she's good at the other stuff. So maybe we're...
We must be each other's literary nemesises.
So much gossip coming out tonight. Wow. Charmaine is writing it all down.
Charmaine's taking photos of the audience. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming today. My name's been Declan Fry. My name has been Declan Fry. It remains Declan Fry. And it's been a pleasure talking to Melissa Lukashenko, Claire G. Coleman, Charmaine Paper Talk Green. Could you give them a big round of applause?
Right on.
Thank you.